The first segment of this training will provide you with an overview of the Marzano Focused Teacher Evaluation Model and the first domain, standards-based planning. Upon review of the new Focused Teacher Evaluation Model map, you should notice that the design intentionally represents a flowchart. You'll notice elements are not numbered, however, domains or areas are thoughtfully placed. The map depicts the importance of standards-based planning, particularly how it directly impacts standards-based instruction and the conditions for learning. Because it's critical for an evaluation model to honor and address the many varied responsibilities of a teacher, the Marzano Focused Teacher Evaluation Model provides a framework to assist both teacher and observer to hold collaborative growth discussions. Intentional excellent planning is critical to instruction. Teachers need to know the standards, how to unpack them, and plan lessons and units to maximize student achievement. However, excellent planning doesn't always ensure student achievement. Therefore, teachers must implement the plan through the use of instructional strategies aligned to the learning target or objective of the lesson. Educators also need to notice when students are not engaged or when rules are not being followed. They must check to see whether students understand the lesson. Even if a teacher has planned well and knows all the right instructional strategies to use, learning can only be impactful if the right conditions are in place. Finally, all educators have professional responsibilities, including the requirement to follow district policy and procedures, maintain their expertise in content and pedagogy, and promote teacher leadership and collaboration. Let's take a closer look at standards-based planning. It's important that viewers review the protocols related to this segment throughout the remainder of this presentation. As we review standards-based planning, you'll notice that this domain is now comprised of 3 elements: planning standards-based lessons and units, aligning resources to standards, and planning to close the achievement gap using data. Upon reviewing the original map for planning and preparing, you'll notice that elements 42 through 49 have been compressed into a focused manner. You'll see the former elements in the new planning and implementation evidence stems listed within the new protocols, which we'll be exploring later in this video. Just as the entire focused teacher evaluation model flows in an organized manner, the following graphic depicts the connection and interplay among the 3 elements in standards-based planning. Planned lessons and units must be aligned to resources that support standards-based instruction, and the planned lessons must also be based on data to help close the achievement gap for diverse learners. For students to reach mastery of rigorous standards, teachers must develop units and lessons using established content standards. Standards are unpacked to create learning targets, objectives, and these learning targets are then embedded to demonstrate a logical progression of learning or a scale. In most cases, our district curriculum guides help us to identify essential standards and group standards into units of study, which is the scope and sequence of the course. Assessments are created to define mastery of each target or a cluster of targets. Lesson plans identify specific instructional strategies appropriate for the cognitive level of the learning targets. To reach mastery of the standard, individual lessons are planned with teachable chunks of content, building a progression of knowledge from foundational to complex. The Marzano model uses the term learning target synonymously with lesson objective or students will be able to. Therefore, teachers plan instruction based on the state standards, unpack those standards to identify learning targets for daily lessons, and then select resources to ensure all students can demonstrate proficiency in the learning target and then ultimately the standard. The taxonomy of a standard or learning target is critical to planning. So what is the taxonomy? Taxonomy is the mental processes in which the human brain intakes information, the mental procedures it uses to understand the information, and the physical procedures associated with mastering the information. The taxonomy is a differentiated hierarchy of cognitive control required to accomplish a task. Marzano names the phases of his hierarchy as retrieval, comprehension, analysis, and knowledge utilization. The lower order levels, retrieval and comprehension, are about accessing and making sense of existing knowledge. And the higher levels, analysis and utilization, concern the creation of new knowledge. The higher levels are dependent on having developed a solid skills at the lower levels. The first step of standards-based planning involves developing a scope and sequence of the major concepts covered during the year. This work is done at the district level through curriculum committees. Clearly, all standards must be taught, but identifying those that are more powerful or essential helps prioritize which standards are critical to student success. The other standards are taught within the context of the essential standard, do not receive the same amount of instructional time, and are assessed as they relate to the overarching essential standard. A way in which the focused evaluation model is a step above previous practice is that there is a strong standards and evidence focus. Teachers unpacking standards fully, knowing exactly what students must know and be able to do, and knowing the taxonomy or level of thinking required are all absolutely essential if we're going to close the rigor gap. In other words, when educators plan effective units, one would expect there to be some type of progression of learning in the plan, a sequence of what was to be taught first, next, etc. This is the same idea with more clarity of building from simpler to more complex concepts across the unit and across lessons. A key critical part of unpacking standards is using a taxonomy, such as Marzano and Kendall's Taxonomy to Educational Objectives, in order to identify the level of thinking students must demonstrate. When educators know the topic or content of a standard, but don't pay attention to the verb, which is the level of cognitive complexity required by the standard, they often are keeping instruction and tasks at too low a level, thereby minimizing the chances that students can be successful on questions meant to measure that standard. There are a variety of resources to help teachers match verbs to Marzano's taxonomy levels. All staff using the Marzano focused evaluation model will be provided with a copy of the blue taxonomy shown on the right side of the screen for an easy reference guide to assist with lesson plan development. How does understanding taxonomy impact my instruction? First, you must identify the standard that you are teaching. Then you must identify the learning objective and a taxonomy level of the lesson. Think about your unit of study. If the lesson is taking place in the beginning of a unit, you're building foundational knowledge followed by a slow progression of thinking and learning designed to deepen student understanding of the content. Therefore, you begin with low levels of the taxonomy and build throughout the lesson. For example, imagine that the learning target or objective is that students will be able to recall vocabulary about a cell. Recall is the taxonomy word in the learning objective. Therefore, as you plan the lesson, your instructional strategies and activities, they should be focused on teaching students the cellular vocabulary. This would be low on the taxonomy and at the beginning of the unit. Remember, your learning objective is the goal or the critical information you want your students to leave your class with that day, knowing and understanding. Your learning objective changes daily depending on where you are within your unit. Therefore, you should only list the main objective and standard in your lesson plan for each day. You will also need to consider how you plan to address any individual needs of your students, like students with IEPs, 504, or your English learners. For example, I, the teacher, work with my co-teacher to ensure that we've modified assignments appropriately as per the students' learning plans. Additionally, while teaching, I monitor my students' learning and adapt and change during instruction if need be. This is key. In addition, you'll need to consider, what are you doing to close the achievement gap? What data have you used to plan to meet the needs of your students? What data are you gathering throughout the lesson that supports student learning? What are you doing with that data? How are you using the data to inform instructional decisions? You could be asked to bring this type of evidence to your post-observation to discuss. As educators, it's essential to consider the what and the how. Keep in mind activities and tasks work together to support students in meeting the learning targets. Activities and tasks are the how, learning targets or objectives are the what. Now let's explore the protocols for standards-based planning. A protocol is a piece of critical common language in learning the model. A protocol is a system of rules. It has a set format. It sets guidelines. Other professionals like doctors, social workers, and psychologists use protocols constantly in their work. Another way this model supports developing teacher expertise is that every element in this focused model has a protocol. The protocol clearly defines the element, provides example evidence that an observer might see when the teacher is using the element, and provides clear delineations of the various developmental levels on the element that the teacher may be exhibiting. This slide depicts all three focus statements and desired effects for the three elements in standards-based planning. The focus statement often gets overlooked, and yet it's very important. It actually describes how the strategy should be done correctly. It's used to gauge if teachers are using the strategy correctly as necessary to be at least at the beginning level. It's basically the definition of the element. The desired effect is the goal. It is what the observer looks for when observing the lesson. In addition to the focus statement and the desired effect, a protocol for standards-based planning includes examples of evidence of planning, which can be viewed in the plans or discussed in the pre-conference. It also includes examples of implementation evidence. Implementation of the plan needs to be evident. If pieces are not able to be observed, teachers should be prepared to discuss the plan, how it aligns to the taxonomy of the learning target, and/or the standard in the post-conference. Teachers should also bring data to explain how the plan for meeting diverse learners was met. It's important to note that all observers understand that written plans may change throughout the course of a week. However, the reason for the change should be addressed in the pre- or post-conference, along with supporting data or issues in scheduling that may have impacted the plan. In the domain of standards-based planning, the common scale is still used. It does have some distinctions because of the particular domain of planning. It still has the not using, beginning, developing, applying, and innovating 0 to 4 scale. At not using, the teacher needs to make an attempt at the standards-based planning, but they don't. Then at the beginning level, the teacher is trying, but parts are incorrect. For example, the resources may not support the learning target. At the developing point, the teacher is developing the plan correctly and doing all the parts in the focus statement. However, what distinguishes developing from applying in this domain is a nuance. For applying, the teacher did more than plan all the parts correctly. He or she actually implemented the plan correctly. So innovating is when the teacher shares what he or she has learned about implementing the lesson. For example, what made it successful or which resources address diverse needs. Intentional planning of standards-based lessons and units should include reference to the educational resources and technology to be used in the lesson to enhance student learning. Resources include anything used to develop and plan, for example, books and websites, and anything required during the lesson itself, such as textbooks, handouts, manipulatives, visuals, response boards, games, and so on. Traditional resources include textbooks, trade books, manipulatives, and primary source materials at the appropriate level of text complexity. Nonfiction text and materials with a wide variety of text structures should be incorporated. When appropriate, the standards of mathematical practice utilized in the unit or lesson should be identified in the plans. Also detailed in the plans are available digital resources that will be used to implement the standards-based unit and lessons. These may include interactive whiteboards, response systems, one-to-one computers, blogs, wikis, social networking sites, or discussion boards. In addition, community resources may be used to enhance students' cultural connections to the content. If there are human resources available, such as a paraprofessional, a co-teacher, a mentor, tutor, the plan should identify how those resources will be utilized effectively to implement the unit and lesson plans. As compared to the scale for standards-based planning, the scale for aligning resources to standards makes a clear distinction between developing and applying. In order to reach the applying level, the teacher not only plans for digital and/or traditional resources, but they also implement the use of aligned resources in the lesson. In order for a teacher to score innovating, the teacher must also then share evidence of helping others select and implement resources to support standards-based units and lessons. As part of the process of standards-based planning, teachers must use data to identify and plan to meet the needs of each student in order to close the achievement gap. Lesson plans developed and focused to help students meet each learning target will include accommodations and adaptations to address the needs of individual students, including English learners, students with IEPs, and those students with little or no support for schooling. Plans will identify specific formative assessments designed to demonstrate mastery of each learning target and include a process for tracking students' individual progress on the learning targets. This will result in a coherent record-keeping system detailing student learning. Planning to close the achievement gap using data requires a deep knowledge of individual students' strengths and weaknesses and intentionally developing a process to address the needs of all students. Monitoring techniques should be determined and intentionally planned to provide data showing that each student, including English language learners, exceptional education students, gifted and talented, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity, makes progress towards closing the achievement gap. Please note the planning evidence and implementation evidence on the protocol for this element. The scale for planning to close the achievement gap using data makes a clear distinction between developing and applying. In order to reach the applying level, the teacher not only uses data to identify and plan to meet the needs of each student, but they also can provide evidence either during the observation or during the conference to show progress towards closing the achievement gap. Once again, for a teacher to score innovating, the teacher must also then share evidence of helping others with using data to close the achievement gap. The Teacher and Observer Conference, pre, post, or both, is an important component to the domain of standards-based planning. In a pre-conference, teachers and observers should be prepared to discuss some or all of the following questions. What is the standard you are working toward in this lesson? What is the specific learning target and taxonomy level for this lesson? Describe where this target fits in the progression of learning. Which instructional strategies will you use to help students reach the learning target? How are these strategies aligned to the cognitive level of the target? What activity will you use to generate student evidence at the level of the target? How does your lesson plan address IEP plans, English learner strategies, or other personal learning plans? What traditional and digital resources aligned to grade level content standards are you using in this lesson? What data have you used to plan to meet the needs of each student in order to close the achievement gap? How will you and/or your students track progress towards the standard? In a post or reflection conference, teachers and observers should be prepared to discuss questions such as, explain how learning targets or objectives were implemented within the lesson. How will you share with others how your use of a strong progression of learning has impacted student learning? How did student assignments align with the level of the learning target? In what ways did students' use of traditional, digital, and human resources support the critical content? In what ways will you share the use of traditional, digital, and/or human resources with other teachers? What data do you have that demonstrates how your instruction and modifications have resulted in all students, including specific subgroups, making progress towards closing the achievement gap? In what ways have you helped others using this type of data? What method do you use to track student progress and communicate to parents? This concludes the segment on standards-based planning. This domain is essential to improve teaching and learning. You're encouraged to review the 3 elements and the related protocols prior to beginning the next segment on standards-based instruction.